Rough weather was blowing up and down the coast, and a blanket of thick fog hung over the harbor. The dispatcher called all the tugs into the great ocean dock. Theodore was the last to return. He had a very strange look on his face. "Is something the matter, Theodore?" asked Emily. "I think," said Theodore, catching his breath, "I think I saw a ghost." "A ghost?" said Foduck. "What did he look like?" asked Hank. "Tell us, Theodore." "I didn't really see it that well," explained Theodore. "It was out near Shipwreck Rock. I saw a small ship. That is, it looked like a ship, only it was a ghost." "Well, how did you know it was a ghost?" said Hank. "It made a strange sound," said Theodore. "Ding, ding." Hank was so startled he bumped right into George. "I could see right through it," said Theodore. "And it was floating in the air above the water." "There are no such things as ghosts," snorted George. "You probably just saw a big wave from the storm." When the other tugs heard that, they were very relieved. "George is right," said Foduck. "It was just a big wave." "George is always right," added Hank. George felt good. It felt good being the tug who was always right. But Theodore was still upset. "I did see a ghost ship," he said quietly. "I know I did." Just then, the dispatcher turned to George and said, "George, I have reports the storm has blown trees into the water near Shipwreck Rock. That could be dangerous for ships. Please proceed there immediately, then report back to me." George headed towards Shipwreck Rock on the edge of the big harbor. He was going along slowly, checking for trees in the water. It grew very quiet, except for the sound of the distant foghorn on Willie's Island. What was that? George heard a strange sound, like a small bell. Ding, ding. He floated a little closer. It was a small ship, but not like any ship he had ever seen before. Its mast was cracked and crooked, and its hull was rotten and rusty. George thought he could see right through it. But the strangest thing of all was that the ship seemed to be floating in the air above the water. And it seemed to be calling to him. "Ghost!" cried George. "Ghost!" And he turned and headed for home as fast as his engine would take him. The dispatcher wanted to send the tugs out to work again, but he was waiting to hear from George to see if the harbor was safe and clear of dangerous trees. George hurried towards the dock, looking very worried. "You look like you've seen a ghost," grinned Emily. The other tugs all smiled, too. All except for Theodore. Theodore knew he had seen a ghost out there. "George," said the dispatcher, "is the harbor safe? Are there any trees in the water?" Well, George didn't know what to say to the dispatcher. He couldn't say the harbor was safe, not with that ghost out there. But he had said there were no such things as ghosts, and after all, he was the tug who was always right. "Well, sir," George began, "I'm not sure. I think I'd better have another look at that ghost. The coast." "Very well, George," said the dispatcher. "This time I would like Theodore to go with you. Take the salvage barge to collect anything dangerous you find in the water. That is all." But, stammered George, "Theodore can't come with me." "Why not?" frowned the dispatcher. Because," said George, "because the harbor is safe. I spoke too soon. I spoke too soon." "George," said the dispatcher, quickly losing his patience. "First, you said you weren't sure if it was safe, and now you say it is. You will leave immediately with Theodore and not waste any more time. That is all." George set off, feeling miserable. He wished he hadn't been so quick to tell Theodore that he was wrong about the ghost. Then he wouldn't be going out again right now. Out to where George was sure the ghost was waiting for him. George led the way towards Shipwreck Rock, with Theodore pulling Bobby Barrage in his salvage crane. It was getting late in the day. The pea-soup fog was hanging even lower over the harbor. We're almost at Shipwreck Rock, Theodore thought to himself worriedly. That's where I saw the ghost. George was worried, too. I hope I don't see the ghost, he thought to himself. Then he had an even worse thought. I hope Theodore doesn't see the ghost. I told him there are no such things as ghosts, and I'm the Tug who is always right. Theodore, said George out loud, you wait here. I'll check to see if the ghost is clear. I mean coast. There may be some big trees in the water that were hit by lightning. I mean lightning. George headed towards Shipwreck Rock. But as soon as he was out of sight of Theodore, George stopped his engine and just floated silently, listening. Foghorn? Seagull? Waves in the rocks. George was naming all the sounds he heard, all the good old familiar, not a ghost sounds. Meanwhile, Theodore floated along by himself, naming all the things he saw, all the good old, familiar, not a ghost things. Shadows, dock, a scary rock. Another foghorn, said George. Boat whistle. Ghost. Ghost! Shouted George. That strange sound belonged to the ghost. George raced to where he had left Theodore. Theodore was nowhere to be found. Then George had a terrible thought. Maybe Theodore saw the ghost. Or maybe the ghost saw Theodore. Suddenly something bumped right into him. Oh! Cried George. Then he saw it was Theodore. Where were you? Asked George. I was worried about the ghost, admitted Theodore. I did see one, even if you don't believe me. Well, I've inspected everything, frowned George. And the ghost is clear. I mean, the coast. What was that? Said Theodore. There was that strange sound again. Ding. Ding. And it was much closer now. The tugs realized with a shudder they were almost at Shipwreck Rock. Theodore, said George, looking very unhappy, I have something to tell you. And then, again, there was a strange sound. It was very close now, and it seemed to be calling them. What were you going to tell me? Whispered Theodore. Tell you? Said George. You had something to tell me? Repeated Theodore. Ghost! Cried George. Ghost! Cried Theodore. Come on, Theodore! Just then they heard, Theodore! Theodore! The ghost was calling Theodore. It knows your name, said George. I know that voice, said Theodore. And gathering his courage, he called, Digby? Is that you?
Yes, it is,
called Digby the cable ship. The ghost's name is Digby? Said George. That's not a very scary name. Theodore remembered Digby. He was an old cable ship who lived near Shipwreck Rock. Just then, the fog lifted a bit, and the tugboats could see that Digby was sitting right up on top of Shipwreck Rock. So it isn't a ghost, said Theodore. You were right all along, George. Now, George was about to say that Theodore had been right about the ghost. But now, there was no ghost. That meant George could still be the tug who was always right. So George didn't say anything. Theodore turned to Digby. Well, how did you get up there?
A big wave washed me up here during the storm,
explained Digby.
Now I'm stuck.
We thought, I mean, Theodore thought,
said George.
that you were a ghost.
Yes, agreed Theodore sadly. With the fog all around, it looked like you were floating in the air above the water.
Well, I wish I could float in the air.
Groaned Digby.
How will I ever get down from this rock?
Well, Theodore had an idea. It was getting late, and the other tugs were wondering where George and Theodore were.
There they are,
Shouted Foduck. Theodore was pulling Bobby Barge, and right beside him, George was pulling Digby,
Digby the cable ship was stuck on Shipwreck Rock,
explained George.
and we got him down with the crane. Good work,
Said the dispatcher.
We were getting worried about you. In fact, we had almost given up the ghost.
Theodore had a very sad look on his face. George was right, he said. There really was no ghost. It was just Digby. George could see how upset his friend Theodore was, and suddenly he knew he had something to say. He took a deep breath,
I thought there was a ghost, too.
said George.
When I was out near Shipwreck Rock,
He began.
the sky was filled with big, dark clouds. When suddenly, I heard a strange sound.
Sound? Chattered Hank. What kind of sound? Ding, ding, shouted George. Hank was so startled, he bumped right into Emily. The other tugs had to laugh. George told everyone the rest of his ghost story, which really wasn't a ghost story. And do you know something? George found out it didn't feel so bad being the tug who was sometimes wrong. Not so bad at all. It was a big, bright, beautiful summer day in the big harbor. All the tugs were still asleep. All except for Hank. Hank was up early and almost bursting his bumpers with excitement over all the wonderful things he wanted to do today. He felt happier than happy. Theodore was up now. Theodore! Theodore! Called Hank, and he nuzzled him a little just to make him extra awake. Do you want to see who can be first to the oil pumps? No, Hank, replied Theodore. I'm still sleepy. Oh, replied Hank. Oh, I'm sorry, Theodore. Well, George was up because his engines were already rumbling. Hank hurried over to George. George! George! He shouted. George, guess what? The work meeting doesn't start for 9 whole minutes. Do you want to visit Blue Nose with me?
Hank, your anchor is dangling again,
Grumbled George. Oops, said Hank. I thought I tucked it in, but do you want to visit Blue Nose with me? No, replied George. Well, Hank floated back to his dock to wait for the dispatcher to begin the morning work meeting. Maybe, thought Hank, the dispatcher will have a really great job for me today.
We have a big oil tanker arriving soon,
Said the dispatcher.
Theodore, Emily, and George. Proceed to the harbor entrance.
Now, Hank thought that bringing in an oil tanker would be lots of fun. Oh, can I help too? He said. The dispatcher turned to Hank.
No, Hank,
He said.
but I do have a job for you. Bonavista barge is a load of bumpers. I would like you to take her around the harbor and replace the broken bumpers on the docks. That is all.
Well, replacing broken old bumpers wasn't the kind of job Hank had been hoping for, but Hank set off with his sunniest smile. Well, maybe his second sunniest smile. As Hank went to get Bonavista barge, he felt the sunshine on his smokestack and the warm water tickle his hull. I bet the rest of the day will be greater than great, he said to himself. Just then, Hank saw Foduck floating along with his serious safety patrol face. Foduck! Foduck! Hank called.
Yes, Hank?
Foduck said.
What is it?
Do you want to race to Bonavista barge? Said Hank.
No, Hank, replied Foduck. I'm very busy now.
And with that, Foduck went on his way. No, 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 no. To Hank, it seemed like, well, that was all anybody had been saying to him ever since he woke up. Hank floated there, alone in the middle of the busy harbor. All of a sudden, sunshine didn't seem so bright. The water not quite as warm. But then, just as suddenly, Hank smiled again. I bet Buena Vista Barge will want to do things I want to do. Sure enough, Buena Vista was waiting with a big load of bumpers when Hank came hurrying along. In no time at all, Hank tied his tow line onto Buena Vista and began to pull. Buena Vista, said Hank. Would you like me to take you the long way around today? That way we can see lots of things. No, Hank, replied Buena Vista. I'm hot, and these bumpers are heavy. Let's just get our work done. Hank couldn't believe his ears. A barge had said no to him. Hank could feel all the no's everyone had said to him building up inside like hot steam in a kettle. It's not fair, he shouted to the whole harbor. No one wants to do what I want to do. Well, I don't want to move dumb old bumpers, and I don't want to work today, and I don't even want to be a tugboat anymore. Now, all the other tugboats who were heading off to work heard Hank blow his stack, and they couldn't believe it. I've never seen Hank lose his temper before, said George. What's the matter with him? Said Emily. I'll find out, said Theodore, and he set off right away to talk to his friend. Hank, called Theodore, why did you yell like that? What's the matter? Nothing, replied Hank quietly. I just want to be by myself. Are you sure that's what you want? Theodore said. But Hank just stared at his anchor. This wasn't like Hank at all. Theodore returned to the other tugboats. Hank won't tell me what's the matter, he said, worried. I'll find out what's the matter with Hank, said George in his biggest voice. I'll go too, said Fodak. Hank was just beginning to replace broken bumpers when George and Fodak rumbled up. There seem to be plenty of broken bumpers to replace today, said Fodak thoughtfully. Hank didn't answer. So, Fodak went on, everything shipshape. Your oil's not overheating, is it? No, replied Hank. Well, good. That's good, said Fodak. Does your hull hurt? Maybe there are barnacles in your bilge water. I don't think so, said Hank. Hank, said George, who was beginning to lose his patience. Why did you shout like that in the middle of the harbor? What is the matter with you? Nothing, replied Hank. I just want to be by myself. Well, grumbled George, who really didn't know what else to say. Just do your best. And with that, George and Fodak turned and headed back to the other tugboats. Hank wants to be by himself, announced George. Heat rash and barnacles, most likely, added Fodak. Theodore gazed out towards Hank. Hank never wants to be by himself, he said. Theodore was getting more and more worried about his friend. I'll go talk to him after we've finished work, said Emily, trying to be helpful. Just as Hank finished replacing broken bumpers, Emily appeared. I've finished work too, said Emily. Would you like to come with me to visit some of my favorite places around the harbor? Okay, said Hank, but he didn't really sound too excited. Hank, are you upset about something? Said Emily. Oh, I don't know, replied Hank. Did someone make you angry? Asked Emily. This time Hank didn't say anything. Look, said Emily suddenly. There's Bedford Bowie. Would you like to race me to him? Oh, you go ahead, Emily, said Hank quietly. I can't race by myself, Emily frowned. She was beginning to lose her patience with Hank. Hank, she said finally, what is the matter with you today? Oh, I just want to be by myself, Emily, said Hank. Then be by yourself, replied Emily. Well, she didn't mean to sound angry with Hank. She was really upset at herself for not being able to make him feel better. Hank watched Emily sail off. He knew he kept saying he wanted to be by himself, but somehow it didn't make him feel very good when Emily left. In fact, it made him feel even worse. A little while later, the tugs returned to the great ocean dock. George was just puffing up some smoke and rumbling his engines to begin telling about one of his adventures when Foduck interrupted him. "It seems," said Foduck, "kind of quiet around here today." The other tugs agreed. It was as if something was missing. "Hank's not here," said Emily suddenly. "You're right," said George. "Did you talk to Hank, Emily?" said Theodore. "I tried," answered Emily. "But he just wanted to be by himself." "Something is definitely bothering Hank," Theodore said. And the other tugboats agreed. "But what can we do?" said Emily. "We've tried everything to cheer him up." Theodore noticed the tugboats had all moved closer to each other, the way they always did whenever they were talking about something really important. And suddenly, he had an idea. "I know something we could try," said Theodore slowly. A little while later, Theodore slowly floated out to the sandy beach. He knew that that was Hank's special quiet place. And sure enough, when Theodore peeked around the bend, he saw Hank just floating quietly by himself along the beach. "Hi, Hank," he called. "Oh, hi, Theodore," replied Hank in a soft voice. "You're having a bad day, huh, Hank?" said Theodore after a moment. "I'm having a really bad day, Theodore," said Hank. "I've an idea," said Theodore. And Hank said nothing. "I think you might really like this idea," continued Theodore. "We need to go over there," said Theodore. "Over there?" said Hank. The two tugs floated slowly around the bend. And then Hank saw all the other tugboats, and they were smiling at him. Hank was very surprised. "Hi, everybody," he said. "What are you all doing here?" "We're going to give you a tug hug," said Theodore. "A tug hug?" said Hank. "What's that?" "Well," replied Theodore, "it goes like this." The other tugboats all formed a circle around Hank. And then moved really, really close to him until their bumpers were all nuzzling together. "This is a tug hug," said Theodore. Well, Hank began to giggle. "I really like tug hugs," he said. And everyone began to laugh and toot their whistles with glee. And just like a dark cloud blowing away and the sun coming out again, Hank felt just the way he'd felt when he'd woken up that morning. Happier than happy. "Thank you, Theodore," said Hank. "I feel much better now." "I do too, Hank," replied Theodore. "I do too." "We all do," said the others.